I want to tell you about a company that has been shaping the computing industry for decades. A company whose processors are literally the brains behind many of the devices you use every day. This company is Intel. But their story goes back much further than you might think. Back in 1968, four engineers left a semiconductor group at a company called Fairchild Semiconductor. They founded a new company called Intel with the goal of making silicon transistors. Their first major customer was a little company called Micro Instrumentation and Telemetry Systems. They needed some custom chips for one of their products. The Data General Nova, and so Intel made them a custom 4-bit processor called the 4004. It had 2,300 transistors and could run at a clock speed of 74 kHz. Today, a 7-year-old could write a program better than that. But at the time, it was revolutionary. This led to other companies asking for custom chips, and soon Intel was flooded with requests. To meet this demand, they started creating a new series of processors based on the same architecture. These were the 8004, 8008, and then the 80186. The 80186 was released in 1978 and was pretty popular for a couple of reasons. For one thing, it had twice the processing power of its main competitor, the Motorola 68000. And secondly, it came with an additional feature, something no one had ever done before. You see, until now, CPUs were sold to manufacturers who would then integrate them into their larger systems. But Intel thought there was an opportunity to do something more. They realized that instead of just selling the CPU, they could make an entire motherboard with the CPU integrated onto it, essentially selling a complete computer brain. This way, a company wouldn't have to design their own motherboards from scratch. They could just buy one from Intel that already had a CPU memory and a basic set of input and output capabilities. This was a brilliant move. In fact, it created an entirely new product category called the personal computer, and the most famous PC ever built, the IBM personal computer, used the Intel 8086 CPU. At this point, it seemed like Intel had cornered the market, but other companies like AMD, Motorola, and National Semiconductor weren't going to let Intel get away with this monopoly. They all began copying Intel's designs, which was legal since CPUs were not patented. This led to a whole wave of low-cost computers during the 1980s. But by the end of the decade, Intel had fought off all the copycats, and they were sitting on a massive $30 billion fortune. With that kind of money, it felt like they could conquer anything. So they set their sights on a new goal: world domination. I'm kidding, not really. But they did set their sights on conquering new markets. One of these was the handheld electronic device. This seemed like a huge opportunity because with the right chip, these devices could become way more powerful. In 1989, Intel acquired a small startup called Initech and used it as the foundation for a new division within the company. This division would focus on developing special chips specifically for mobile devices. But while Intel worked on these chips, another company made a similar breakthrough first. For a few years, Intel ignored the RM7. They thought mobile devices would never be powerful enough to replace desktop computers. But as the 1990s went on, this proved to be a bad assumption. Suddenly, everyone was carrying around these powerful computers in their pockets, and Intel hadn't even made a chip for any of them. How did they fall so far behind? Well, the problem was that the technology Intel had been using since the 1970s simply wasn't compatible with the low power, low heat environment of a mobile phone. You see, shrinking transistors past a certain size creates problems. Heat becomes a major issue, and when you try to cool chips by putting them in a device with a fan, things get loud. But if you don't use a fan, the chip will overheat and break. After years of struggling to solve this problem, Intel finally cracked it in 1993. They developed a new type of transistor called the Intel 31 nanometers process. This allowed them to build smaller chips that ran much faster and stayed much cooler. They called this new line of chips Pentium, and it was indeed very fast. The Pentium was nearly twice as powerful as the previous generation chip, but it was also extremely expensive to manufacture, which kept the cost of the computer high. This meant that PCs remained out of reach for many families. So in 1997, Intel decided to create a cheaper version of the Pentium called the Celeron. But this didn't really work. People wanted cheaper computers, but they still wanted them to be fast. The biggest problem was the cost of the Pentium. It was over $1,000, which was far more than most people could afford. Even the cheaper Celeron was still too expensive for many families. But then in 1998, something happened that changed everything. A little company called AMD developed a cheap chip that could rival the Pentium. This chip was called the K7, and it shook up the entire industry. It forced Intel to take drastic action. They needed a chip that was not only cheaper than the K7, but also cheaper than the Pentium. The solution was to abandon the Pentium altogether and start from scratch. And in 2001, Intel unveiled their newest, cheapest chip yet, the Pentium 4. While it wasn't as powerful as the Pentium 3, it was significantly cheaper to produce, and this brought down the price of computers to below $1,000 for the first time ever. Suddenly, computers were becoming commonplace in homes across America, but this success made Intel arrogant. They got cocky and complacent, and eventually this led to a disaster. What happened was that Intel had focused so much on single-core processors that they completely missed the rise of multi-core processors. As other companies like AMD and Nvidia began releasing multi-core chips, Intel's market share plummeted. Investors began dumping their Intel stock, and the company's value fell from $100 billion to $50 billion in a matter of months. This crisis forced a change in leadership. Paul Otellini stepped down, and a new CEO named Paul Hassel took over. He knew that the company was in trouble and that they needed to change direction fast. So he appointed a new head of research, a man named Justin Ratner. Justin's job was simple: develop a new chip architecture that could compete with AMD and Nvidia. Justin assembled a team of the brightest minds at Intel, and together they worked on a top-secret project. Over the next 3 years, they struggled through countless setbacks, but finally in 2008, they had a breakthrough. They developed a chip called Nehalem that featured 4 cores, hyperthreading, and a new instruction set. It was more powerful and more efficient than anything on the market. And to make matters even sweeter, it was also extremely cheap to manufacture. But just as Intel was about to make a comeback, the Great Recession hit. Computer sales plummeted, and Intel's revenue fell from $40 billion to $25 billion. But despite this, they continued investing in research and development, and it paid off big time. In 2011, they unveiled their newest chip, the Ivy Bridge. It was the first chip to feature 22-nanometer lithography, meaning it was incredibly small and efficient. It also had 4 cores, hyperthreading, and support for AVX instructions. It was truly a powerhouse. But once again, Intel got cocky and stopped innovating. Sales started to decline, and competitors started catching up. This forced Intel to acquire a new company called Altera to bring new life into their products. But it didn't work. Sales continued to decline, and Intel's position in the market continued to weaken. It seemed like Intel was doomed, but then something unexpected happened. The cryptocurrency craze of 2017 brought a sudden surge in demand for GPUs. This saved Intel from bankruptcy, but it wasn't enough. They still needed a new strategy if they wanted to remain competitive. So in 2019, Intel did something they hadn't done in 25 years, release a completely new processor architecture. They called it Alder Lake, and it marked the return of Intel as a major player in the CPU market. And that brings us to today. Intel is currently valued at $100 billion. They're the third largest company in the US, and they're still the biggest producer of CPUs in the world. But the competition is fierce, and Intel can't rest on their laurels. They need to keep innovating, or they'll lose their crown. I've been your host. Thanks for watching till the end, and I'll see you in the next one.